Ladies and gentlemen, now if you would like to shut the curtains down this side, if that would work for you, then you will see you won't be daunted by the weather and realize that we're actually probably going to be snowed in. So I hope our speakers are going to talk for a long time. Today is very much what I would call a celebration of the home service in more ways than one. First of all, we should be treated to an insight into what for most of us was our principal source of entertainment and information in the home, the BBC Home Service. And secondly, of course, it's a great pleasure to introduce two of the home team, namely two fellow members, Ed Stourton and John Pennicate, who will be in conversation about Ed's book. I understand Ed and John have never actually worked together, although they both had careers and have careers at the BBC, and distinguished careers at that, but I gather that current affairs and news are not the same thing. Well, there's a discovery. However, both of them, one representing the news side and one the current affairs side, both of them have spent a lot of time in some really, really weird places. Including BBC Studios. Edward's latest book, and he's written many, one of which is obviously celebrated by this marvellous photograph of him and his dog. His latest book is called Auntie's War, and if you didn't pick up the message earlier, it is for sale in that corner afterwards, and he will very happily sit and sign it. It's rooted in World War II, and it explores the BBC's role in the origins of what we would now call fake news. It wasn't called that then. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ed Stourton and John Pennicate in conversation.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Ed's book is a very learned work of history. And I was going to say that nobody here would remember listening to the BBC Home Service during World War II, but then looking around me, I think perhaps I should revise that. Obviously, one of the first things I'm going to ask Ed is what inspired him to write it, what made him put so much work and so much research. If and when you come and read it, you'll see how much he's done. But before I do that, let's quickly paint in a little bit of historical background. What was the BBC doing? What was it transmitting? What was it broadcasting at the outbreak of World War II?
Well, one of the most intriguing discoveries I made while writing this book is that Hermann Goering invented John Humphreys. That doesn't sound like an answer to your question, but if you'll bear with me, in a roundabout sort of way, it is. There was a television series before the war in 1939, which closed down immediately the war was declared, because it was just thought too expensive, enraging people who bought what we call vision sets, which cost several £1,000s at that time. There were two domestic radio networks, a regional network and a national network. But there'd been a huge amount of debate in the last months of peace about whether the whole BBC should be shut down, because the worry was that those could be used to help German bombers as navigational aids, where they could use the transmission towers to home in on their targets. And in the end, the BBC engineers came up with a brilliant wheeze, which involved merging the two networks so that all the transmission stations were transmitting the same thing, which meant that if you wanted to shut down a group of them, say around Coventry, if that's where you thought the raid was going to happen, you could do that, but people could still hear because the signal was strong enough from elsewhere. And that is what created the Home Service, which in the fullness of time, of course, morphed into Radio 4. So the Archers is, as I say, down to the Luftwaffe. I mean, that's a slightly...
What about the foreign language services of the BBC?
Well, there was a thing called the Empire Service, which started in 1932, which was mostly at that stage, tea planters in Ceylon, huddled around their radio listening to the King's message at Christmas time. A little bit of broadcasting in Arabic, where the Middle East services got off the ground. And after the Munich crisis in 1938, when everyone thought war was coming and Chamberlain, of course, did his thing with a bit of paper and peace in our time, suddenly the BBC latched onto the idea that Foreign Service broadcasting would be a sensible thing to get the British message over to the key players in Europe, so they started broadcasting in German, Italian and French. And those, of course, were to become the enormous growth areas during the Second World War.
Well, we'll be coming to them
sure.
again. My assumption, and I suspect most people's, would be that during the war, during World War II, government censorship had an iron grip over what was broadcast, even more than over the newspapers, that the whole thing was effectively governed by the now defunct, mercifully, Ministry of Information, which, according to J.B. Priestley, who you quote in the book, simply answered to the War Cabinet. Now, did the BBC have an independent voice in the war or not?
Well, I think you'd be vastly overestimating the efficiency of government during the war if you think that it had a grand grip on what the BBC did. There was a huge amount of debate, again, all behind the scenes in the late 30s about how to manage the BBC in wartime with an inevitable itch the government had, as all governments do, to control it. But a lot of people saying if everyone thinks that it's controlled by the government, they won't believe it. And in a very Brit sort of way, they came up with this curious structure where you had, as you say, the War Cabinet, the Ministry of Information, which only came into being formally as soon as war was declared, with a kind of loose handle on the BBC. Military censorship, of course, was very tough indeed, but the broader policy censorship was left to the BBC themselves, and they became their own censors, and they had this strange system of what's called a switch censor. So there's a bloke sitting there in the studio through every transmission with his finger on a button, and he could just do that and take the network off the air if, you know, something inappropriate was said.
I can think of lots of people I work with in the BBC who'd love to have had that.
Well, the awful thing is I tried to find good examples of when people used it, and the only one I could really find was an unfortunate clergyman who was cut off for being a bit lefty. I mean, it was... and they were very... I mean, eventually they're very reluctant to use it because they thought it would discredit their reputation, particularly with the Americans, because the American broadcasters were, in Churchill's view, absolutely crucial to changing opinion in the United States and encouraging people to the idea that they might come in on our side.
Let's take one of the darkest moments at the beginning of the war, Dunkirk.
Yeah.
Was the BBC able to report what was actually happening or not?
No. Dunkirk's an extraordinary occasion in the history of reporting, in that it's one of a huge story and there wasn't a single reporter there. It was all done through interviews back in Blighty afterwards. They sat on the information about what was happening in Dunkirk incredibly heavily. I went through all the news bulletins during those crucial few days. The Operation Dynamo, which was the code name for the operation to bring people off the beaches, began on the 20th, I think it was, and 4 days later, there was no mention in the broadcasts of any kind of evacuation. There was talk of withdrawal towards the coastline, orderly withdrawal and that kind of thing. So they really sat on it. And Churchill himself, who of course had just become Prime Minister, in the War Cabinet, Duff Cooper, who's the Minister of Information, said, I really think we ought to tell people a bit about what's happening, because it's going to come as a hell of a shock when they find out just how bad things are. And Churchill said, no, I won't have any of it. What is also interesting, though, is that afterwards, some of the commanders in Dunkirk were angered by the way that the BBC reporting had not reflected what their men were going through. So in strict censorship terms, that was the darkest hour, if you like. But it already began the movement towards thinking, actually, we can't do this. We have to tell people what's happened.
Churchill himself, you say,
yes,
wanted to suppress what was happening.
Yes.
What was his attitude generally to the BBC?
Well, there's a document that I came across where Churchill's reacting to the suggestion that some BBC people should be included in the honours list and that an announcer should get an OBE. And he sort of scrawls that over. This is never while I'm Prime Minister. In fact, never while Britain still stands will we give honours to anyone from the BBC. He felt that during his years in the wilderness, the BBC had kept him off the air, which it probably had to a degree, and he resented that. He also rather regarded the BBC as below stairs. There's a wonderful exchange of memos in late 1939 where a BBC secretary gets a call from Churchill's secretary, who was the Admiralty at that stage, to discuss last-minute arrangements for his appearance on Sunday. And the BBC bosses say, but we're not expecting him to come and broadcast on Sunday? Did we invite him by mistake? Who's responsible for this? And it turned out that Churchill, rather as if he was sort of ordering breakfast in a hotel, had just sort of said to his secretary, ring up and book me in on Sunday and I'll give the nation a talk. It was a very sort of de haut en bas attitude. He tried to take control of it completely in the summer of 1941 and failed, and then rather sort of forgot about it and let it get on with its stuff. He shamelessly nicked the V sign, which was a BBC creation. It was somebody in the Belgian service who noticed that the first letter of the word for victory in both Flemish and French was a V, and rather as you might say something was going viral today, he encouraged people to start chalking out V's in France and Belgium, which they did, and in fact it took off all over Europe and was really a sort of huge story at the time. So Churchill thought this is a great idea, and he started doing his thing. So he was quite happy to use it as it suited him, but I don't think I think he took a pretty dim view of the institution. He hated Lord Reith as well. He called him the Wuthering Height because he was very tall and Scottish.
Lord Reith had gone by then.
He'd gone by then, but he was Minister of Information.
His ethos hung on. Yeah.
His ethos very much. His ethos still hangs on, I think we could probably say.
Well, let's go back to the big question then. I mean, this is a learned work.
Well, thank
Why
you.
did
Actually,
you
don't say that.
embark-
That might put people off. I'm not sure.
No. It's also a
You mean it's a
fascinating and
hugely
stimulating
amusing
work.
and
as well.
entertaining. Yeah, okay.
I'm one of the few people who have read the whole thing, I tell you. And I vouch for that.
I had lived to tell the tale. Yes, bear the scars.
Why did you embark on it?
Why did I embark on it? There are sort of two stages. The first is a story that's not in the book. It's a little bit involved, but I'll tell it because the more I think about it, the more I think is really why I wrote the book. When I was based in Paris as BBC's correspondent in the 1980s, the police arrested a man called Paul Touvier, who was an extraordinary story in himself. He'd been a leader of the Milice, which was a fascist militia in wartime France, working with Klaus Barbie of the Gestapo. And at the end of the war, he was hidden by the Catholic Church in monasteries for decades. In fact, right up till the time he was arrested in 1989 when I was there, which in itself is sort of an amazing story. And we did a film about him for Newsnight. And in the course of it, we interviewed the public prosecutor. At the end of the interview, he said, you must go and see this bloke, Louis Goudard, because he's just come forward as a witness in this case, and his evidence is absolutely crucial. Go and see him at this farm outside Lyon and ask him what happened. And his importance was because he'd been with a group of people who'd been rounded up to be shot in reprisal for the murder of a Vichy minister. He was a communist, and the other six, were Jews. And at the last minute, Touvier took him out of the line of execution. He was allowed to go free, and the others were shot. And for Touvier, this showed his patriotic French nature. Of course, in a trial for crimes against humanity, this was an absolutely clear case of anti-Semitism. Anyway, we turned up at this guy's farm, and he said, are you in a hurry? And I said, well, I'm afraid we are a bit because we squeezed you into the schedule. And his face sort of fell, and I said, why? And he said, well, I've never told my story to anybody, not even my children, and I want to tell it to you because you're the BBC. And he then unfolded this amazing account. He described how the night before the execution, if you were a Gaullist, you'd sing the Marseillaise to keep your spirits up. And if you were a communist, you'd sing the Internationale. And he said one of their group was a young trained opera singer, and he sang the aria from Tosca that Cavaradossi sings the night before he is killed. And he said even the German guards in the prison went quiet and listened to this song. I mean, it was just fantastic stuff. You can imagine for a film, it was just brilliant. We put this on and we put the music on. And he then, at the end of this, telling this story, he said, let's open a bottle of wine, and he put Tosca on the gramophone and he gave us lunch. And it was, I think, why us? Why the BBC? Why did we mean so much to him? And that's one of the things I try to explore in the book, is that why the BBC, what it stood for, became such a sort of extraordinary power in French life as much as anything else. And what were the values that it expressed, which people came to sort of regard it so highly for? So
Well, you let me quote your own words back at you. You said,
Of course.
you say in the book that you feel sentimental about writing about the BBC in World War II.
I do.
Then again, you say there was a great and mysterious miracle. This is Ed's words in this story. What was it? What was this great and mysterious?
Well, the first thing I should say, as far as feeling sentimental, you, I'm sure, have had this in your career, that sheer excitement of dealing with a technology that's suddenly letting you do new things. And I think these guys had the most enormous fun at the BBC during that period. They were engaged in something really important. The technology was allowing them to do all sorts of things. I mean, I remember when I started in news, we still were on film, so if you went out and filmed something, you had to come back and wait for 40 minutes while it went through the baths before you could even start cutting it, which you could imagine was you would know what it was like. It was absolute hell. Suddenly they invented this thing called electronic news gathering, where you brought back a sort of cassette and the pictures were already there. You could transmit from all sorts of places. I remember right at the beginning of the technology being asked to cover a constituency meeting somewhere in Cumbria where the Labour MPs were resigning to join the SDP, and driving up a sort of Cumbrian fell to a field full of sheep where there was a transmission van, and we put our thing in and it shot back to London and it was on news at 10. And of course now that sort of stuff is everyone does all the time, but just the thrill of doing that. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think these guys were having such fun.
What was the great and mysterious
miracle? The great and mysterious miracle, I think, was this, that put it very simply, at the beginning of the war, everyone assumed, as you did in one of your first questions, that the BBC was there to do the government's bidding and to pump out propaganda. And by the end of the war, the idea that truth was a really powerful weapon of war had been established, and the natural assumption was that the BBC told the truth. And I think that's a sort of massive thing that's important not just for the history of the war, but actually of the way that our broadcasting culture has been formed. And it's a culture I've grown up in, and I think we should be very proud of it, actually.
Well, the other side put a very famous broadcaster on the air, Lord Haw-Haw, speaking perfect English, putting out German propaganda.
Yes.
And he was actually listened to really rather a lot in Britain, wasn't he?
He was, hugely.
He was a very popular broadcaster. Now, didn't the BBC do the same thing?
The BBC didn't do the same thing, actually. There was, what did do that, although actually did it in a much more curious and slightly mysterious way, was a thing called the Political Warfare Executive.
That was a separate organisation.
It was a separate organisation, but it was very closely tied to the BBC. And in Bush House, where its headquarters were, some of the staff remarked there were two lifts. One lift would take you to the BBC European Services, which were dedicated to truth and all the values that we think are important in journalism and broadcasting. And the other lift took you to this strange, murky world run by the Political Warfare Executive, which was all about lies and fantasy. And I mean, it is, Julian mentioned fake news. It is an extraordinary story, which really hasn't been very well told until today, that the official history of the Political Warfare Executive wasn't released until 2005. So secret was it. And what they did, or one of the main things they did, is they had these radio stations, although they used to call them RUs, research units in code, in the gardens of Woburn Abbey. And they used the stables at Woburn Abbey as their sort of main operational headquarters. And they would beam fake news programs into Germany, pretending to be within Germany itself, and create scares, and all sorts of, mad ideas were pumped across the airways like this, which, it's what we're told the Russians have been doing to us recently.
What about the BBC's own German language service?
Well, that was much straighter, and in fact the spooks at the PWE used to get very frustrated with the BBC because it wouldn't lie for them. They would encourage it to do all sorts of things, and huge bureaucratic battles were fought on precisely this issue in Bush House. So, and the theory was that you had white propaganda, which is what the BBC did, and you had black propaganda, which is what these guys did. And in the course of the war, and I come back to the mysterious, the miracle, if you like, the idea that the truth told in the white programs was itself a very valuable weapon, became more and more established as a kind of guiding principle of the way the BBC should work.
So you're saying that the BBC, during the war, under government oversight, I won't say control, but under government oversight, did not itself partake in fake news, as Julian put it?
No, I don't think they did. In fact, they fought quite hard to resist any kind of pressure for them to indulge in fake news. And it wasn't a sentimental thing. If you take the French service, for example, which I mean, you probably all know about the way that the BBC personal messages were used to transmit coded messages to resistance groups. Do you want me to just briefly describe?
There's the one just before D-Day, isn't there?
There were hundreds before D-Day.
Yes.
And D-Day itself was signalled by a line from the poet Verlaine, Les sanglots longs de l'automne blessent mon cœur d'une longueur monotone. What?
My tears.
The languid violins of autumn wound my heart with and so forth. Anyway, the point was that these messages would be picked up by resistance troops, and they would then go out and blow up a bridge or whatever it was. And they had to trust the source. They were risking their lives, so they had to trust the source they were getting the messages from. And so the spies themselves, the SOE people, said, you've got to give honest news, because that's the way we'll get the trust of the resistance, and they will be willing to follow the messages and do what, risk their lives according to what we tell them. So there was, it really became an article of faith that the BBC shouldn't put out fake news.
The BBC did not take part in any of the great deceptions of the war?
Well, not really, no. I mean, there was an incident before D-Day when the SOE decided to sow an idea in German minds that actually the attack was going to be at Calais and not where it was. And what they did was they got a few people who were operating in France to sort of leak out the idea that anything that mentioned a cake on the BBC was an indication that Calais was going to be chosen as the target. So this, was leaked out, and various German intelligence picked it up. And then the SOE into their personal messages slipped lots of sort of stuff about cake, hoping the Germans would move troops there, which indeed...
Have you heard the story that there was radio record request programs and American servicemen stationed in Britain were able to request songs on this program? And there were a lot of requests from the 1st United States Army Group stationed in Kent under General Patton, which didn't actually exist. Wasn't this fake news?
I wasn't aware of that. I don't know. All I can really say is that having looked at particularly the French service, looked at the output put in some detail, there was such a high premium on getting people to trust what they heard that I think most of the fake news stuff was left to the black propagandists. If you think, de Gaulle, for example, was created by the BBC. People in France didn't really know very much about him. He'd only been a minister for 3 weeks, and it was the fact that his voice came booming over the airwaves that led to the support that he got. And people weren't going to let that be compromised. It was such an important channel of communication.
Spool forward 70 years, you're still in a news hot seat, Ed.
Well,
is fake news still around?
It's around more than ever, isn't it? I'm not sure I don't think the BBC these days is guilty of pumping it out. I hope not. I haven't noticed that.
But it's a problem?
I think it's a real problem, yeah. And that's a technology thing, isn't it? We haven't learnt how to deal with the fact that people get their information from so many different sources, many of which deliberately lie.
Such as?
Well, the Russians' use of Facebook and social media and so forth.
Yeah.
We don't know quite how to cope with that.
And I nearly said our, but it's many years since I worked there. The BBC's attitude to these fake news sources today?
It's tricky, because one thing that came to light during the Arab Spring was that social media is an enormously powerful tool for people covering a story like that when you've got official silence about a subject and you've got tweets and so forth telling you where the next demonstration's going to come, feeding in pictures, all that kind of stuff. So you can't just ignore it. It's really important. But you have to have a very effective mechanism for checking what you're putting out, and we are very careful about that now. I'm not saying we never make a mistake, but we are. And B, to the possibility that you are indeed being manipulated. I mean, I'm very old school. I don't understand this stuff really, but I think the BBC's reasonably sort of got a grasp on that side of things.
Let's
today.
spool back then 70 years,
Okay.
and the bit of your book which I confess interested me the most, which was about war reporting.
Yeah.
And about the journalism that the BBC was able to do in partnership sometimes with the newspapers, but sometimes operating rather differently from the newspapers. It evolved very rapidly in the war, you describe. What was the direction in which it evolved most? Stylistic, technical?
The two things are intimately tied up with one another, I think, as they always are. Before the war, if you wanted to record something on location, you had to take the converted laundry van, which was what Dimbleby took off famously to the floods.
Richard Dimbleby.
Yeah, Dimbleby Senior. He showed what you could do with on-the-scene recording in 1938, when there were terrible floods in East Anglia, and he took his laundry van off and he recorded stuff on the ground, which nobody had really done until then. By the beginning of the war, that had evolved into a car. You could fit the stuff into a slightly smaller vehicle. And during the Battle of Britain, people used to zoom all over the south-east looking for dogfights above that they could describe as they recorded in their car. And by D-Day, they had evolved something called a midget, which by today's standards wasn't. It was a huge, great thing like this. But it was like a gramophone recorder, and it had a wax disc and a needle, and you put it down and you held the microphone up and you got the noise. And some of them actually carried that up the beaches during D-Day. One man could carry it. And what that meant was that suddenly you could be in the front line and you could tell people what it looked like. And you could get actuality description, which had never really happened in a war before. Nobody had ever been able to bring it into your living room in quite that way. Shall I read a little bit of one of them? I mean, there's a guy who I think, inevitably, some of the people who are very famous then have now disappeared. But as well as Dimbleby and Vaughan Thomas and Frank Gillard and one or two of these others who you will have heard of, there was a chap called Guy Byam. And he had first been in the Royal Naval Reserve, and his ship had been sunk, and he'd swum to safety through burning oil, lost the sight of one eye, joined the BBC French service because he was half Belgian, I think. He then took part in a torpedo raid on the Tirpitz. He was parachuted into behind enemy lines on D-Day, parachuted into Arnhem, the Bridge Too Far episode, and finally killed during recording on an American plane during a bombing raid on Berlin at the age of 26.
How did he get out of Arnhem?
Well, that's what I was going to read you. He swam the Rhine, and when he got out, I just found this. Well, I'll just read you a bit of his broadcast, if I may, because I think it's just terribly good. At about 10 o'clock, we slowly groped our way through the woods, while the artillery on the other bank poured fire into the surrounding countryside to make the Hun believe we were attacking further along the river. And in the drizzle and the wet, the men felt their way through the dense trees where the foliage was split and where one could hear the Germans talking as they sat somewhere in the darkness, crouching in their slit trenches. And we groped our way on, and the whole wood smelt of the dead, and the farms and little houses were on fire. And then we came out of the wood into a field and crept in long lines down to the Rhine. The mortars were bursting in what seemed like a spray of sparks, almost amongst us now, and we lay on the ground, pressing our faces into the wet grass. It was then that I decided to have a go at swimming the river, the men themselves patiently waiting their turn to get into a boat, and if a man floundered in the dark, got ahead of someone else, there would be a quiet, "Come on, chum, take your turn." And the boatloads got over the Rhine, and swept down by the current, I at last managed to get to the other bank. The hell was behind us. It's just, impressionistic, vivid. You feel you're there. And I think the impact of that sort of stuff coming into people's living rooms
Was Byam actually in Arnhem?
Yeah, he was.
When the place was
He was.
the perimeter was being closed in by the Germans?
Absolutely, yes.
And was he able to broadcast?
No, that he recorded when he came out.
Yeah.
So there's no transmission, but he recorded the scene, swam the river, and then there's a wonderful picture of him sitting in Broadcasting House when he's back with his clothes covered in mud.
If he'd survived, he would have been a big star, wouldn't he?
His writing is beautiful, and yes, it's very And I looked at his BBC personnel file, and it's full of, sort of 5 stars for this reporter, and he's brilliant. And at one point, somebody says, I'm extremely concerned that one of the big movie companies is going to find this man because his writing's so good, and they're going to pinch him. Very, very touching.
A hero.
A real hero. I mean, there are some of them, there are less sad but quite funny moments in some of the personnel files too. Vaughan Thomas, in his file, there's a wonderful memo.
This is Winfried Vaughan Thomas.
Winfried Vaughan Thomas, from the personnel man in BH, demanding that he return 2 stopwatches which he took with him when he left the OB unit and has failed to hand back into stores. And you wonder why this rather sort of trivial thing is in the files, and you look at the date and you realise it's the night before he entered Rome with the victorious Americans. They sent him this memo. And at the bottom, the man has put, I'm glad to hear you on the air a lot at the moment, but worry about your stopwatches too.
Well, that dispatch from Arnhem, it wrings your heart. What are the other great moments of war reporting?
Well, I think you have to, it's a very famous broadcast, but I think Richard Dimbleby's broadcast from Belsen is a masterpiece of its kind, partly for its restraint, partly because of the vividness of the description. And if you look at it, there's very few adjectives in it. He lets the bare facts speak for themselves. But also, and it's a very clever, rather BBC-ish thing, this, he delegates the emotion that he clearly feels to those around him. So he describes the reaction of the British troops, and you get a very strong sense of what the right emotions are, but it's not him telling you that he was upset. He's giving you a sense of what people feel around him, which gives him a sort of bit of distance and makes it all the more powerful. So he ends it by saying, never have I seen British soldiers move to cold fury in the way of those who opened Belsen this week. And it's the British soldier. He's giving you his response, not. Is
there a lesson there for today's report?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think that's. Well, I was certainly brought up with the idea that when you report, nobody's interested in what I think or what I feel, but I am there to interpret what the correct emotional response is to an event that you see around you. It's a really. I think it's a really interesting area, that how you mediate in an intelligent way, reporting on something truly grisly. There's always a danger that you slip into mawkishness, and personally I prefer restraint. Equally, you can argue that if it's a really appalling scene, you look cold or sound cold if you don't show your feeling. But what he did, the way he did it, it seems to be perfectly judged, and that's an amazing skill. And also, sorry, but I think what all of these people did was write the rules that we play by today. That's why they're so interesting. They were making it up as they went along. There was no guidebook. Nobody had a radio war before. You had to sort of work all this out as you went along.
To what extent was Richard Dimbleby and Winfried Vaughan Thomas and these other great names from the past, to what extent were they produced? Were they managed?
They had very much in the field free rein. They were the boss. They had the status of honorary captains. The engineers were also made honorary captains, but were only allowed an honorary lieutenant's pay. I think was that's a tiny distinction. And there's quite a funny memo from Dimbleby complaining that the engineer he was sent out on an exercise with before D-Day didn't know how to salute and had a scruffy cigarette hanging out of his mouth and clearly wasn't officer class and didn't know how to behave. So I think they had enormous freedom of operation once they were out in the field. Yeah.
But Monty got quite upset with some of the reporters, didn't he?
Oh, one of them, BBC broadcast a bit of a speech that he was angry about, and he sent, I'm going to try, maybe Howard Marshall, I'm not sure. Anyway, he got him sent home immediately, and nobody questioned that at all. I mean, today you'd make a huge fuss if a reporter was sent home at the behest of a general. In those days, everyone accepted it. I mean, one's got to accept that one of the big differences then was we were all fighting a war, and the BBC completely accepted that it was part of that effort. The correspondents wanted to win, all of that sort of stuff. The kind of rows that you had during the Falklands when the BBC memo went round saying, we don't refer to our soldiers, we are the BBC, we are not Britain. Those sorts of issues just
I'm
won't.
a Falklands veteran.
Oh, well, there you are. You remember all that very well in that case. Shall I read? There's a very good letter written by a guy called A.P. Ryan, who's the sort of senior home person, which I'll just read you a bit from, because he expresses a sort of kind of reporting ethic that I think is very admirable. He says, "You handful of men," they were all men, I'm afraid, "have been chosen to undertake the most important assignment so far known to broadcasting. Describe the events of which you are an eyewitness as accurately as you can. Give credit, of course, to gallantry and generalship. Let pride and achievements of our armies come through, but never seek to jazz up a plain story. Events will have their own drama. You are not dramatists. The play and the persons in the play are ready-made for you. You are broadcast reporters sent out to observe and tell us what you have seen. We shall edit hard at this end and kill anything that isn't worth using. There are no back pages in a broadcast. Everything we put out is in the nature of front page stuff." Which I'd like to have gone off to war with that sort of in my backpack.
To introduce a slightly critical note,
Yeah.
you say that they didn't report, or hardly reported, the bomb plot, Stauffenberg's bomb plot against Hitler in 1944.
Well,
why was that?
That was a German service issue, and was a particular German service problem. The British government as a whole was deeply divided on the question of whether you could have a good German. In other words, was Nazism a kind of natural German condition, or could you conceive of the idea that there might be some good Germans you could appeal to? And that fed through into the way the BBC broadcast to Germany, because if you thought there were good Germans, then you broadcast to attract them. But if the official line was, well, actually, they're all Nazis together, there was no point in broadcasting to appeal to good Germans, because there weren't any, and anyway, they were sort of under everyone's thumb. And as a result of that, and the sort of balance of the argument tended in the second direction, the idea that broadcasting details of the plot, which would indicate that there were good Germans around, that people were opposed to Hitler, just didn't particularly sort of appeal. It didn't seem to have any particular propaganda value, because they didn't think that they could stir up any kind of revolution within.
Because we were committed to unconditional surrender.
We were committed to unconditional surrender, and therefore we were going to beat them. And we weren't saying, look, if you get rid of him, we can have a ceasefire or an armistice or anything that kind. The British message, the official, from Washington as well as London, was only unconditional surrender is acceptable. So from that flowed the broadcasting approach.
Well, let me quote you something else that I noticed.
Gosh, sounds alarming. Sort of thing that interviewers do to ministers when you're trying to trap them. But anyway,
Something that slightly startled me. You mentioned George Orwell, who was probably the most famous person to have been a BBC employee during the war. And indeed, he's been honoured with a statue outside Broadcasting House now, has he not?
He has.
Yet he resigned from the BBC and wrote in an article of the corporation's, and I quote, moral squalor and ultimate futility. What did he mean?
Well, take you back to the statue. The man who did the statue is a very old school friend of mine, in fact. And he fought quite hard and won. The words that are on the wall of New Broadcasting House next to it, which I will just read you. Quote from George Orwell: "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." We all think it's terrific that our bosses have to walk past that quotation every morning. And indeed, it's right by the place where the limousines pull up, delivering people for interviews. So ministers have to see those as well. That's really important.
But why did he resign?
Well, I think it's more surprising that he worked for the BBC at all than it is that he resigned. He, after all, is the author of another famous phrase, which is, all propaganda is lies, even when one is telling the truth. He despised propaganda, but the reason he got involved in it is he really took issue with pacifists. He said, for example, he said you cannot feed yourself lunch on food that has been brought here by British sailors risking their lives and call yourself a pacifist because you are effectively taking part in the war. He's been wounded in Spain. He was a very sick person anyway. He tried to get into the army, but he was medically unfit. So the only way he thought he could contribute to the war effort was to join the BBC. He'd been born, after all, in India, so he joined the Far East, the Asian services. And actually he had the most wonderful time initially. He ran a sort of rather brainy magazine, which magazine The Airways, I should say, which people like T.S. Eliot used to come on and read poetry, in the hope of appealing to young Indians, educated Indians in particular, because although he believed in independence for India, he also thought that the threat of a Japanese invasion of India was much more serious than an Allied victory and eventually independence in that direction. So he did pursue a propagandist agenda, despite his beliefs. He left because it turned out that, unlike the services broadcast in Europe, nobody was listening to the BBC in India. In fact, nobody could afford a radio. So, unsurprisingly, somebody rather unkindly observed that he did a couple of broadcasts which was probably only heard by the Japanese monitors. And it was just that sense of broadcasting to the airwaves and not making a blind bit of difference that eventually made him give up, because the moral squalor quote is absolutely right, and he did feel he was in moral squalor, but he thought that was the least he could do, but the only thing he could do to contribute to the war effort, and that he could, as he put it, at least keep my little corner a bit cleaner by taking part. It's interesting because it's very. He was morally compromised and felt himself to be morally compromised, but he had a very clear kind of logical way through the arguments that had got him into that place. He had bad moments as well. One writer of a broadcast, I forget who it was, asked him permission to use a passage in Homage to Catalonia, which of course is his book about the Spanish Civil War. And he looked through the book again, and it includes a diatribe against the propagandists who don't do the fighting and dying, but sit at home encouraging hatred. And he says, 5 years after I wrote that, here I am working for the BBC. But I think he was morally very brave in lots of ways in the way he...
Fascinating bit of the book.
Yeah.
Before we throw it open to the assembled company to ask you questions, one last one.
Yeah.
And that is, what then, World War II, 70, 80 years ago, what's the legacy of the BBC's broadcast during that period?
I do think it's the period during which our broadcasting culture was formed. I think this is pure opinion. I can't support it in evidence, but I think the fact that the television series disappeared so that World War II was a radio war and not a television war is one of the reasons we have such a rich radio culture today. Somewhere in our sort of collective memory is that image of people sitting around the radio listening to a Churchill speech or a J.B. Priestley postscript during the dark days of 1940. I think, as I said earlier, the idea of truth as a valuable public service kind of thing was not obvious when the war began, and it was obvious when it ended. And I think, I mentioned my experience in France. So many parts of the war, this is perhaps a slightly self-regarding thing to say, but so many parts of the world, when you say you're from the BBC, well, you must know this, people sort of look at you and say, come in, sit down, let me tell you a story or two.
You can sweet-talk your way into a lot of things.
It's still a massively powerful brand. I'll just say one sort of controversial caveat to all that, which is, I think, one of the reasons the BBC was able to do what it did during the Second World War is that domestic politics was largely on hold between the formation of the Churchill Coalition in the summer of 1940 and 1945, which meant that they weren't endlessly taking calls from different parties complaining about political bias. And the big difference between then and today is that today we are living in an enormously divided political climate, and the business of balancing things is much more complicated and much more difficult to navigate than the straightforward business of saying we have one objective, we've got to win the war and we've got to tell the truth to do it, which is rather slimmed down. That's what was going on. Now, who are you broadcasting to? Which truth are you reflecting? The does truth exist? You know, it's a much murkier and more difficult world to manage, I think.
Now, we've overrun our time, needless to say.
Apologies.
Julian, do you want to offer people the opportunity to ask questions to it? I mean, you're going to pass the mic around? You have the mic. Does anybody want to put a question to Ed? Yes, a hand's shot up over there. So can we get a mic over to them?
Thanks. It's partly to alleviate Julian's guilty feelings. And it would be traditional if this failed, if this microphone failed, it would be traditional at Hurlingham. But it's okay, is it?
It's fairly traditional at the BBC for things to go wrong like that, I have to say. But
Ed, obviously a very fascinating book, but very Germano or German-focused. My father was a president of the Japanese. Right. Was there a Richard Dimbleby sent into Changi or the railway or anywhere else?
No, I mean, I think probably that theatre suffered in broadcast terms in just the way it did in general terms of public attention and sort of emphasis. I mean, I'm perhaps to go back and have another look, but I'm not aware of any great. My grandfather was in Changi too, but I'm not aware of having who was, and he had been a BBC broadcaster before the war, as it happens. But I'm not aware of anything of that power to come out of the Eastern Theatre. I didn't look so closely at that, so that doesn't mean there isn't a little bit around. But as I say, I suspect that theatre suffered in BBC eyes just as it did in the eyes of the public in general. As being, you know, I mean, of course it wasn't a sideshow, but there was a feeling, wasn't there, that we won the war in Europe. Let's not worry so much about that.
Anybody else got a question? Yeah, a hand's shot up over here. There's another one over at the back. Can somebody ferry the mic over?
Is that better?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, great.
Referring to your last point about the way that the country pulled together after the formation of the Churchill Coalition, was there any example of the dissent within the country prior to that, particularly, you know, having recently seen Darkest Hour at the cinema, the conflict between the Chamberlain-Halifax appeasement versus the Churchill fight them on the beaches? Was that reported at the time, or leading up to Churchill's appointment?
That wasn't very greatly reported, partly because the news from the war front was so dramatic, because of course that's just as the German assault begins and runs up through to Dunkirk, when if you look at the bulletin, I mean, I did look at those bulletins, and they are all about what's happening on the front, and, you know, the King sends a message and so forth. There's nothing from, or very little from Westminster, which, and anyway, the political reporting wouldn't have reflected the inner councils of the Tory party in quite the way that we'd expect it to do today. Nevertheless, as time went on, bits and pieces did begin to arise. For example, when the Beveridge report was completed, there was a quite serious tussle about the degree of attention that the BBC should give to that, because a lot of people on the right saw that as an essentially socialist enterprise and believed that if the BBC was promoting it, that would be seen as a sort of left-wing move. At the same time, people in the language services were seeing the Beveridge report as a very positive bit of propaganda, because here was Britain offering the idea not just of winning the war, but of building a brave new future after the war. So you did have a tension where, for example, I think it was the German service put on several programmes about the Beveridge report, and backbench Tory party MPs got up in the Commons and started complaining that the BBC was showing itself to be its usual lefty self by promoting this programme, which was so clearly of a socialist kind. So you see that kind of thing bubbling up, but particularly during the Darkest Hour period, there's such a sense of the nation being under an existential threat that everyone just sort of mucks in. And if you look at I looked at some of the bulletins during Dunkirk where the censor has done quite heavy pencil work on the script. There's no suggestion anybody in the BBC took exception to that. They just all thought, we've got to survive here. Memos would come in from the Foreign Office saying that Stafford Cripps had complained that a BBC broadcaster had upset Stalin, and in Broadcasting House they'd all rush around and make sure it didn't happen again. You know, there's a real sense, not that they were being compelled to do things, as your opening questions touched upon, but they were just doing it because they were Brits and we were fighting a war, and this is what they thought was the best. So, as I say, as the time went on, more dissent begins. The politics as usual comes into the frame a bit more. But in the really tough periods of Dunkirk and then the Blitz, there's a real sense of everyone pulling together, really. I think it's true, you know, the myth is to some extent true.
Ed, I have a question. There are two questions, and there's really one for each of you.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, yeah.
So the first one concerns, you mentioned William Joyce, the American Irishman, Lord Haw Haw, and his broadcasts.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether you formed a view on P.G. Wodehouse and his broadcasts, whether it came within the ambit, whether you contrasted it at any stage.
Well, it's quite funny. In some of the early papers on Haw Haw, one of the suggestions people make is that to counter Haw Haw, the BBC should put P.G. Wodehouse on the air as a sort of authentically British voice. And of course then 6 months later he's caught by the Germans and starts broadcasting for the other side. I don't think it's quite fair to compare them. Joyce was ideologically committed to fascism. He also had a very strong sense of the social injustice in Britain, and that was one of his most effective sort of messages in his propaganda, was to play up class decisions and talk about the upper nation and the lower nation a great deal, and the government was extremely sensitive to that message. And I don't think P.G. Wodehouse was anything like as ideological in that way or as skilled a propagandist. I think it's just a terribly sad mistake, and I think that's the view that the authorities took of it in the end. Whereas Haw Haw went on broadcasting, and there's his extraordinary final broadcast where he's clearly totally drunk, but delivers this kind of Nazi rant just before the fall of Berlin, and then legs it into the countryside, where he was caught because he couldn't stop talking. It's extraordinary. I mean, he and his wife settled in a coastal little town on the Baltic Sea, sort of hid among the population, and kept very discreet. And then one day he was in the woods and he found a couple of British officers who, by that time Germany was under British occupation, looking for wood in a forest outside the town. And he started to chat with them, and he's such a distinctive voice. And eventually one of them said, "By any chance be Lord Haw Haw, would you?" And he said, "Well, yes, I am actually."
Any further questions?
Thank you very much. So just very quickly, a second question, which relates to the Falklands, and thinking about the broadcast. So you've got H. James and his battalion heading off towards Goose Green. And if I remember rightly, there was controversy that something was broadcast about Camilla Creek House, and so people were able to work out what the route was. I appreciate it's nothing to do with Auntie's War, but it probably comes back to Dunkirk and the reason why things aren't said, because by saying things, you're giving information to the other side. Would you like to say a little bit about the Falklands and what was said at the time?
That's John, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's for John, absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, what's the actual gist of that?
Well,
So
you're a Falklands broadcaster.
Yeah.
I'm now switching hats. I'm now turning to the interviewer. But as I understand it, would just reflect a little bit on whether the reporting took sufficient
So
care.
we effectively gave information, or were in danger of giving information to the other side, as of course we were at Dunkirk as well.
I mean, there's a long story I could tell, and there isn't time, and this isn't the right place, about the trouble that Panorama got into during the Falklands War. Do you remember there was a cartoon in the Daily Express, Traitorama? And I managed to secure an interview with the Foreign Minister of Argentina, Costa Mendez. And when I rang up the editor of Panorama and said, "I've got an interview with the Foreign Minister of Argentina, aren't you pleased, aren't you grateful?" He said, "Oh, God, the trouble I'm in." It was a very, very different situation. What we have now is minders, yes? When you're in a war zone, you have Ministry of Defence hangers-on, controlling everything you do. And then you have embedded reporters who are effectively attached to a military unit and so closely attached to a military unit that they identify with that military unit. Have you had much experience of that?
Well, I have done wars, but I've never been an embedded reporter. Well, I have once in Afghanistan, but actually, the only thing I would say is these guys absolutely were like that. You know, wonderful reporters though they were, in our terms, you'd be extremely squeamish now about acting as... I mean, they were sent to train with military units precisely to give them a sense of identity and being part of the team. They were officers. They were treated as proper officers. I mean, you know, not just honorary ones. So I think a lot of the dilemmas that came up in something like the Falklands didn't come up then, because, as I say, everyone was on the same side. There was a much stronger sense, because it was an existential war, of the BBC and the BBC staff, you know, playing the game, being British, wanting to win the war. And I think it's a rather different circumstance to the Falklands, where the BBC tried to distance itself a bit from that, and it was a different sort of war. You know, there wasn't the same sense that it was... I mean, during the Falklands, we were in many ways a divided country about that war. That's not true of the Second World War. And anything like
we never declared war on Argentina, whereas I guess we did declare war on Iraq by invading it. I think you could say that.
Yeah.
But Richard Dimbleby and Winfried Vaughan Thomas and these other guys, were they ever that much censored?
They were sent, actually, the entire war reporting unit was sent on a self-censorship course in the Army's main training place for dealing with psychological warfare and censorship and interrogation. And they were put through an exercise where a joke German, Abwehr, Army intelligence person, would pick bits from various reports and then stick them together and try and show the reporters how their information, if they weren't careful, could be brought together to give away a real military secret. So actually, they were more censoring themselves than that they were being told that they couldn't say things. They also, one of the things that you got because of the technology was the ability to describe very vividly what was happening on your little bit of the battlefield. That allowed them not actually to do too much strategic reporting. So you didn't have pieces on War Report in the evening saying, you know, this is where the assault's coming, or the kind of big picture military stuff that might have been useful to the Germans. You had these very vivid, intimate descriptions of what it was like for you and the men you were with, and what the battle looked like from that particular, you know, trench
They
or foxhole.
identified units, did they not? They identified regiments and units. They said the Devonshires are going in here, and
well, that was. I mean, there's a. No, I think mostly they didn't actually. I think they were extremely. There's this extraordinary exercise just before D-Day when the Germans invaded Oxford. They put on this huge exercise across Oxfordshire between two armies, and the BBC went along to report it. And they did it under full censorship rules, and in that I know they were not allowed to identify any insignia, cap badges, anything. And they went along, and that's how they were allowed to take part in D-Day, because they showed that they could produce an engaging report without giving sort of big pictures and details that might provide military information.
But the interesting thing is that in World War I, Philip Gibbs and the great war correspondents of that era were kept in a chateau miles behind the lines, were they not?
Yeah.
And fed stuff. What changed the attitude of the army to bring these reporters up front?
The Oxford experiment was very important in doing that, because they felt what it would allow them to do was to give people back at home a sense of what their people were going through.
People's war.
Yeah, absolutely.
People's war.
Yeah. I mean, you can call it propaganda if you want, but that's what was going on. You know, a desire to increase that sense of cohesion between the population back at home and the armed forces, which you could do in a war like that. And it must have been thrilling, sitting there at home, tuning into War Report, which is an extraordinary programme, night after night, telling you, you know, where your son might be fighting, or whatever it was, giving you a real sense of the ordinary soldier's perspective. And they were encouraged, they were specific, they had a kind of sort of post-mortem meeting after this exercise in Oxfordshire, and the generals all came in and said, we love this, we love the sound pictures, as they call them, but try and get the focus down on the ordinary soldier and not say too much about what's going on the battlefield in general. So that was a deliberate strategy, which the BBC went along with.
And do you think it worked?
Well,
What do you think the BBC did for morale in World War II? National morale.
Gosh, that's such a big question. I mean, then you get into things like the comedy shows, like It's That Man Again, things like Digging for Victory, all these programs that were designed to encourage people to engage in self-sufficiency to deal with the Blitz. I think, actually, I tell you what, I'll come back to the French. I think in France, the impact on morale was absolutely massive, because with the German invasion, you've got a feeling for many people in France that the world had just closed off to them, and they suddenly listened to these signals coming through the night air telling them that somewhere or other freedom was alive. And there's incredibly moving...
France was undefeated.
Yeah, exactly, and that there was hope. And there are these really moving letters in the BBC archives, just addressed to La BBC Lounge, saying, very unashamed, sort of straightforward way, you keep hope alive for us. One rather nice one from a woman in Paris who said, I don't understand English, but I listen to the English service as well, because it makes me feel that somebody's with me. You know, I don't think you can overstate the importance of that to keeping hope alive in France.
Well, I hope anybody who reads Ed's book finds it as interesting and as absorbing as I did. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you, Ed. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Very nice.
Julian,
to meet
do you want to...
thank you all for coming, by the way. I can't believe how many people there are.
Ed Stourton, folks.
It's an extraordinary privilege, and it's actually feels rather naughty trying to interrupt two chums chatting about one of our favourite institutions and giving us a very eloquent glimpse behind the scenes of something we all live with and have grown up with. It's something we take for granted, which is truth. No matter how much we agree with it, I suspect the great joy about the BBC is that the other side probably disagrees just as much. Thank you very much indeed. You will have got the hint before that the books are on sale over in the far corner. And the writing hand is well trained to do what it must. Remember always the words of Chris Patton, who said that he was advised by Margaret Thatcher, sign as many books as possible, they can't return them. John, thank you very much for joining in. Where are you? Yes, good. The two of you talking together, as I say, has been an inspiration. In a small way, could we just say thank you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's like a bottle. Thank you very much.
What a wonderful gift. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay.
Well, best of luck with the sales.
Thank you very much.